Welcome to Golden Blue, everybody, home of the college football fan. And don't forget about the checklist. Hat check, sunglasses check, Pepsi check, notes check, sources check, and thick skin is a check. And don't forget to send gear to represent your team and yourself in my background. Send it to P.O. Box 360, Liberty, South Carolina, 29657, and get yourself a shout out. On to the next video. In case you're wondering, these are the teams that we don't have represented for the mini helmets. As you can see, we actually have quite a few big brands that's not represented here at Golden Blue. I do know that Nevada and Cincinnati are on their way as far as mini helmet representation. So get your team represented here on Golden Blue. We're about to hit 13,000 subscribers. And you already know what time it is, so might as well sit down, brace yourself, and buckle up because you are entering the speculation zone. Well, this could be terrible news for the ACC. It looks like Florida State might just have enough of the nonsense of the ACC as far as not making enough money or not even being close to the SEC or the Big Ten. They are not happy and they are making some noise. Florida State's athletic director is saying this: at the end of the day, if something's not done, we cannot be $30 million behind every year compared to our peers. We'd break even in roughly 4 years if they made up the $30 million. They are not happy right now. In fact, Florida State produces roughly 15% of the revenue for the ACC, but they only get 7% in return. So every year they're in the ACC, the gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger, because the return is only half, less than half of what they're making for the ACC. That's not right. I smell lawsuit all over the place. Oh no, media rights deal, grant of rights, can't really do anything about that. But my gosh, they're basically stealing from Florida State. The ACC and ESPN is stealing from Florida State. So, what did Florida State do? They looked into it. They want to know how much the buyout, how much would it cost for Florida State to leave the ACC? It's not $500 million, folks. Not even close. For Florida State to leave the ACC, it would cost roughly $120 million. That's a lot of money. Do not get me wrong. That is a lot of money. But compared to $500 million, it's not close. It's actually doable, especially with the money that Florida State makes. And on top of that, you know the SEC and the Big Ten would start fighting. I mean fighting over Florida State if they left the ACC and paid that $120 million buyout. In fact, the conference themselves could chip in and pay Florida State. They might actually try to outbid each other. Oh, they said that they would help with $40 million. We'll go $50 million. And then it bounces back to the other conference. They said $50 million, we'll go $60 million. It could turn into a bidding war to get Florida State. Kudos to Florida State. Somebody has finally broke their silence. I've been wondering about this because we've been talking about those 8 teams needed to vote down to dissolve the grant of rights. Well, if that's not an option, if there's not enough teams to do that, or if there's a loophole that I'm missing, or teams backing out of that, and just 1 or 2 teams, or 3 or 4 teams, or 4 or 5 teams, so on and so forth, want to back out and leave the ACC, they will have to buy out. But it's not $500 million. That blows my mind because that's been pounded into my head over the past 3 to 4 years. No Golden Blue, there's nobody leaving the ACC. $500 million buyout. No Golden Blue, nobody's leaving the ACC. $500 million buyout. No Golden Blue, nobody's leaving the ACC. $500 million buyout. You were wrong. Wrong. $120 million as of right now. And I do think that it goes down next year as well. So maybe they do it this year. Maybe they can wait till next year or the year after and do it cheaper. But the longer you wait, Florida State, yes, the lower the buyout is, but the more money you lose because you're not making a lot of money in ACC and you're losing money. The revenue gap is ridiculous between the ACC, Big Ten, and SEC. This is sheer nonsense. So this could happen sooner rather than later. Florida State just may have opened the can of worms that is the ACC and show, look, the ACC grant of rights aren't as ironclad as you think. The buyout isn't as steep as you think. It is doable for those bigger brands. Now, if a Wake Forest or a Boston College wants to leave, it's not going to happen. They're not going to pay $120 million to leave the ACC. But those other teams, and we're talking Florida State, Miami Hurricanes, Clemson Tigers, North Carolina Tar Heels, Virginia Cavaliers, perhaps the Virginia Tech Hokies, if they're promised a spot, Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets, if they're promised a spot, they would leave as well. If teams are promised a spot, that $120 million buyout doesn't look as large because they're seeing what these other conferences are making, and they're like, we can make that up in no time. In the meantime, the longer we remain in the ACC, the bigger that gap gets, the harder it will be to make up that revenue gap. So there's all the incentives in the world to get out of the ACC sooner rather than later as long as they have a spot promised. That is the key to this entire situation. These teams have to have a spot promised in order for them to chuck up $120 million, leave the ACC, have nowhere to land. No, they're not going to do that. They have to land either in the SEC or the Big Ten. So they have to have a promised spot. This could really blow up the ACC. If Florida State does it, then Clemson's looking over there. Well, now Florida State's making all that money. Yes, that buyout is a lot. Man, they're over there making $80 million a year now, and they'll make up that buyout in a couple of years, maybe less than a couple of years. We really need to think about doing this, guys. And then North Carolina's like, well, Florida State's done it. Clemson's thinking about doing it. We need to do it. And it's a chain reaction, more and more. Well, as long as they talk to these other conferences, and those conferences are like, yes, we got you. Come on in. We were wanting to expand anyways. We thought maybe you guys were going to vote dissolve. But hey, if you want to do the buyout, we might chip in a little bit. I don't know. But yes, we 100% have a spot promised to you. So if this happens, if Florida State jumps ship and it turns into a domino effect and more teams jump, I'm going back to my list. I know I've said it several times, but for you new viewers, here you go. The teams that I think that could jump to the SEC are not Florida State. No, I think Florida State jumps to the Big Ten. They are actively pursuing AAU status. Florida State and the SEC, they don't get along. The SEC turned them down, and then Florida State turned around and turned them down and joined the ACC. They don't get along. Florida State wants to join the Big Ten. So for the SEC, I think it will be Clemson. I think they'll take the Miami Hurricanes. I think they'll take NC State, and I think they'll take Virginia. For the Big Ten, I think they'll take Florida State. I think they'll take North Carolina and Duke, who's attached at the hip. And I think they'll take Georgia Tech. So these other teams, if you're not on that list that I just mentioned, you need to be nervous because Florida State might be about to push over that first domino. And if they push over that first domino, these other teams could fall as well and be like, we're doing what Florida State did. I know that's a lot of money, but we will make up that money in a short amount of time. It's just getting it over with. You just pay that $120 million. It is a huge amount. Maybe there's some type of payment plan as well. You could do that, so it's not going to hurt as much. But seriously, if you're a major brand that can make so much more money than what you're making in the ACC, you really have to start considering your options. If the buyout's not $500 million and it's closer to $120 million, you need to be figuring out what you want to do. Because the longer you stay in the ACC, the wider your revenue gap between you and the other teams are going to be. And it'll get to the point to where you're not going to be able to make it up. You got to jump sooner rather than later. So if you know for sure that you have a spot, come up with a plan to pay that buyout and get out of Dodge. The ACC might be done, and Florida State might be the finger that pushes over that first domino. So y'all have in the comment section. Number one, do you think Florida State will push over that first domino? I mean, we're seeing Florida State took a legal counsel and looked into that buyout, and they came up with that $120 million buyout. They said a lot of negative things about the ACC, something I have not heard from Florida State ever. I've never heard Florida State say a negative thing about the ACC. So that's another red flag for the ACC. Florida State actually said some derogatory things about the ACC, or rather the money that they're making in the ACC. I've never heard that from Florida State. On top of that, if Florida State is the first team that goes, who do you think will be the second team, and so on and so forth? And who do you think goes to the SEC? And who do you think goes to the Big Ten? This is it, folks. This might be the start of the collapse of the ACC. Buckle up. We'll see what Florida State does. Maybe another team pops up and says, well, we're thinking about it too. But right now, all eyes are on Florida State as far as the future of the ACC. That's all I got for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.